back wet and get us back into the frame of mind of the chapter. That's always profitable. And what's going on? So, Romans chapter 1, verses 18 to 32. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who hold the truth in unrighteousness, because that which may be known of God is manifest in them, for God hath showed it unto them. For the invisible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. Because that when they knew God, they glorified him not as God, neither were thankful, but became vain in their imaginations, and their foolish heart was darkened. Professing themselves to be wise, they became fools, and changed the glory of the uncorruptible God into an image made like corruptible man, and to birds, and four-footed beasts, and creeping things. Wherefore God also gave them up to uncleanness through the lust of their own heart, to dishonor their own bodies between themselves, who changed the truth of God into a lie, and worshipped and served the creature more than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. For this cause God gave them up unto vile affections. For even their women did change their natural use into that which is against nature. And likewise also the men, leaving the natural use of the women, burned in their lusts one toward another, men with men, working that which is unseemly, and receiving in themselves that recompense of their error which was meet. And even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, God gave them over to a reprobate mind, to do those things which are not convenient, being filled with all unrighteousness, fornication, wickedness, covetousness, maliciousness, full of envy, murder, debate, deceit, malignity, whisperers, backbiters, haters of God, despiteful, proud, boasters, inventors of evil things, disobedient to parents, without understanding, covenant breakers, without natural affection, implacable, unmerciful, who knowing the judgment of God, that they which commit such things are worthy of death, not only do the same, but have pleasure in them that do them. Let's just bow in prayer. Father, I thank you now for this evening. Pray that you might open thy word up to our hearts. Lord, that we might consider the truth about man. And Lord, we see that's the way Canada is going fully in much of the world. Lord, we thank you. In some ways, Father, I thank you for this virus. Lord, we don't know if revival, awakening, but Lord, this is a time for people to consider their ways, and that you might, in some measure, restrain the wickedness of man. I thank you for this small group here. Bless us in thy word. We ask it in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. Just a kind of a quick revert view of where we are. Verses 1 to 17 is Paul's introduction in the Gospel of Romans. And in no other introduction of his epistles does he say so much about the gospel in the introduction. In the very first verse, he says who he is. He's a servant of Jesus Christ, called to be an apostle, separated unto the gospel of God. In verse 3, he says this gospel is all about God's Son, Jesus Christ, our Lord. And then he continues on. As he greets the Romans, he says, I'm ready to come to Rome to preach the gospel to you. And I'm not ashamed of that gospel, because it's the power of God unto salvation to them that believe. And in this gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed. And that's what we need, to have God's righteousness revealed unto us and revealed in us. And so that's his introduction, and I really enjoyed going through that. Now from verse 18 to chapter 3, verse 19, we perhaps have the longest single stretch of God dealing with sin the nature of sin, the acts of sins, the judgments of sins, what man is really like. And this has been going on since Adam and Eve ate the apple, the fruit, and it's going on in individuals' hearts. It's going on in countries and societies and neighborhoods. And the only thing that restrains it is God's mercy. The only thing that restrains it is God's mercy. Here in chapter 1, verses 18 to 32, I believe we have an overview of man's sin. A lot of them say this is the sin of the heathen. Because, the Jews would not worship in Paul's time. We're not idolaters. But I would say they have their own idolatry, covetousness, and these things. I would say in general, this is all mankind. Specifically, yes, maybe the heathen countries, God gives them up. But in a sense, God gave up the nation of Israel too, at least to some extent. Just want to make a quick highlight of these verses 18 to 32. Well, first of all, we see God's judgment, and then we see 3 stages of man sinning and God's judgment. And it's a progression down. As they turn from God, they sin. As they sin, God judges them. He gives them up. And they do more sin, and then God judges them again. And they end up in verse 32, which is not a pretty picture, but truly what we see around us is not a pretty picture at all. And sometimes what we see in ourselves is not always a pretty picture. The judgment of God is because God's creation, all men, just through creation, know that there is a God, that He has eternal power in His Godhead. And Paul says that they are all without excuse. We're not going to get off on a sidetrack. What about the poor widow who was abused in Africa, and she's trying to raise 3 kids, and she never heard the gospel, and her life's just struggling in misery, and she's going to hell. That bothers our North American thinking. In some ways it should. I can say that God is holy, and this is God's judgment, and she's without excuse. That's hard. That is hard. And because they knew who God was, and yet in verse 21, here's their first step down, it says they glorified Him not as God. There was a time when they knew God, and they glorified Him not as God, neither were they thankful. To me, that's the start of it all. And I don't know, what was that movie that we watched about the guy that went back in time? Or went ahead in time? He thought he could write a book without, and realizing that...
Time Changers?
Yeah. It's not enough to have a good society as a society based on Christ. Because as soon as Christ is diminished, the good will start slowly deteriorating. That's the idea there. And so, say that in my own heart, if I quit glorifying Him as God, if I quit being thankful, where would I end up? Except for the grace of God, which restrains, and for His children chastens and afflicts us for our own good. And so this is the start of it. They were without excuse, and their first step down is they do not glorify God. And that led them into idolatry. And idolatry, God's judgment is, verse 24, God gave them up to uncleanness through the lust of their own hearts. This is God's first judgment, to dishonor their own bodies between themselves. And I agree with most of them. This is not talking about homosexuality. This is, I would say specifically, adultery, fornication, sexual uncleanness. And the two go hand in hand. Idolatry and adultery go hand in hand. As soon as you leave worship of God, you're into idolatry. As soon as you're into idolatry and God gives you up to that, then you're into impure sexual. That started in the United States. I shouldn't say started, but it blossomed, it bloomed in the United States and Canada back in the late 50s to 60s, the sexual revolution. And we're bearing the fruits of that today. And those who cried out against it or against the trouble. And you see, as we look at this downward fall, the church is following the world. And these things are now becoming accepted in the church. So there's the first. They weren't thankful. They became idolaters, and so God judged them. He gave them up to uncleanness to dishonor them. And so Paul wraps it up here in verse 25. They changed the truth of God into a lie. So these are key. We're seeing they didn't glorify God. It led into these sins. God gave them up and they fell into these sins. Now, they changed the truth of God into a lie. And they worshiped and served the creature more than the Creator, who is blessed forevermore. I love how Paul has to just interject that. And then he says, for this cause, for this very reason, God gave them up to vile affections. That's where we are tonight. And so again, the problem is they changed the truth of God into a lie. God gave them up in judgment. And they've gone from adultery and fornication to homosexuality and lesbianism, transgender, and on the fringes is bestiality, abuse, rape, all things that are following in these things. And that's what we're looking at tonight. And then verse 28, and even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge. There's the third thing. They went from, first of all, they don't glorify Him as God. Secondly, they changed the truth about God into a lie. This is God. No, it isn't. And now they don't even want to think about God. And so God, the last one is God gave them up to a reprobate mind, a mind devoid of judgment. And what does that lead them to? All sin. You say, well, were not these things there before? Yes, they were, but they were not. They were hidden. They were restricted. Society did not openly embrace them. But when God gives up a people, a nation, a society, then these things are fully embraced. And you say, how can a country, a people do these things? It's because of God's judgment. God's judgment. I'll give you that quote later. But I'd like to read just a quote from James Montgomery Boyce's book. And I want that to sink in your head that God gave them up. God gave them up. Our job is to stand in the gap. Our job is to understand what's going on around us. Not to accommodate, but we don't want to offend them. The next thing you know, we're approving them. The next thing you know, we're promoting them. And there are churches doing that today. Even these things, calling it right. There's churches, denominations that are naming the name of Christ, naming the cross, trusting in Jesus as Savior, who don't know right or wrong. And they're saying, no, God approves of homosexuality. God approves of transgender. Let me just read from James Boyce's book. Thus far in our study of Romans, we've been concentrating on human rebellion against God. And we have seen indeed, Paul has explicitly told us that the wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against men and women because of this rebellion. In what way is God showing wrath? It is clear what we have done. So this is a bit what I've said. We have suppressed the truth about God. And I thought that was just a heading there in verse 18. And the other three things I mentioned were like how they did it. But anyways, he says we've suppressed the truth about God. That's one. We refuse to glorify and worship God as God. We decline to be thankful. And as a result, we've become darkened in their thinking. We have become fools. Nevertheless, up to this point, we have not been told specifically of anything that God has actually done to unleash his wrath upon humanity. Now, this changes. For the first time in the letter, we are told 3 times in succession that God has abandoned men and women to perversion. The sentence, God gave them over, it is found in verses 24, 26, and 28. But here's the irony. And he's going to quote from Oscar Wilde. Man's punishment is to be abandoned by God. But of course, that is precisely what man has been fighting for ever since Adam's first rebellion in the Garden of Eden. Man has wanted to get rid of God, to push him out of his life. In contemporary terms, man is saying, God, I just want you to leave me alone. Take a seat on the chair over there, and shut up, and let me get on with my life because I want to live it. And so God does. Like the father of the prodigal son, he releases the rebellious child, permitting him to depart with all his possessions and goods for the far country. Say, have you ever thought, well, you know, I would like to sin and be able to get away with it. You ever want to get away with a sin? And what would be the worst thing that God could do? You know? Well, to let you sin and get away with it. That would be his wrath, not his love. And yet, a lot of Christians are promoting grace to the point that God's grace permits you to sin. And you just be happy that the blood of Christ covers everything. And it does. I rejoice in that greatly. But the blood of Christ and the grace of God teaches us that denying all ungodliness. Let's look at God's second judgment here in verse 26. For this cause, this reason, because they went into idolatry and to adultery, God gave them up. He says, okay, you haven't repented. I'm going to give you up. And I thought of this phrase was with Pharaoh. And Paul explains that in Romans chapter 9. He says, and whom he will, he what? He hardeneth. He hardeneth. And so God gave them up unto what? Vile affections. Vile affections. And we have this phrase, for God gave them up. I'll quote from the Psalm. Psalm 81:12. God speaking, he says, so I gave them up unto their own heart's lust, and they walked in their own counsels. We see that happening today. I'll give you another quote. Matthew Henry, spiritual judgments are of all judgments the sorest, and the most dreaded. Spiritual judgments. Otherwise, we should be very concerned for Canada, the United States. And yet, for the most part, Christendom is at best slightly disturbed, and at worst, they're just going along asleep, not awake at all. Notice here how God calls it what? Vile affections. Shameful. The word affection means inordinate, excessive. Excessive, wicked affections. Dishonorable, shameful. What does man call it? Man calls it what? Pride, good. This is right. And God calls it vile affections. Let me just read from Leviticus chapter 18. And yes, this is a law, and we're not going to stone them. But God's morality hasn't changed. Later on, we're going to refer back to Genesis chapter 2. It says the husband and wife were one flesh. And Jesus says, God made them male and female. And for this cause shall a man cleave to his wife. There's God's program in Genesis chapter 1 and 2, and it hasn't changed. No matter what dispensation we're under. There's sexual morality, marriage, one man, one woman. Leviticus 18, verses 22 and 23. Thou shalt not lie with mankind as with womankind. It is what? Abomination. Neither shall thy lie with any beast to defile himself with, neither shall any woman stand before a beast to lie down. It is confusion. Abomination. Morally disgusting, abhorrent. This is what God gave them up to. That which should be an abomination, they are now practicing and embracing. Paul says here, even their women, and I put down, when the women goes, so does society. And you think, well, women by nature want to protect the children, protect the home. Men have a tendency to be more self-centered. I won't say we're more sinful in some ways, but in some ways we are, because the women have more of an eye on the children and the needs of the family, and a man has more of a desire, as God says, that husbands love your wives as you love your own selves, because we do love our own selves. And by nature we want to love our own selves and not love our wives. We want to put ourselves first. The women put the children up there, and that's why you see homes where the dad's gone, or the wife is bringing the children to church. The wife is having devotions with the children, and the husband is doing his own things. In some cultures, this is like the norm, and it's becoming the norm in most of Canada, and much of Canada, if the women are doing that. But we see now the women themselves. Paul says, even the women. And so this is God's judgment to those who refuse to glorify and be thankful, who embrace idolatry, and who embrace, I won't call it sexual freedom, I call it fornication, adultery. Actually what it is sexual slavery. Jesus says that whosoever committeth sin is the servant of sin. They're not happy, by the way. In this sexual freedom and revolution, women are more exploited now than ever, and kids are not cared for. Isn't that what they're looking for? Well, we got to treat women equal. Women are worse off. And, we got to protect the kids and make sure the kids don't get abused, and the abuse is up because their needs aren't getting met. They have no dad at home, and who knows what the mom is doing. Let's look at the sin here described, and I want to look at these things. We're talking about homosexuality, we're talking about lesbianism, and we could include in that transgender. And the first word that I saw here is natural. For the women did change their natural use to that which is against nature, and likewise also the men, leaving the natural use of the women, burned in their lust one towards another, men with men. That's unnatural. Now, I don't know when I'm going to be fined, put in jail for saying that. And you say, well, if he's recording it, it goes on YouTube. Who knows, right? You're a hater. You're unloving. And sometimes I read the headlines on the internet, and some public figure stated that transgender women are not really women. And, I didn't bother opening it up, but the backlash is you're a hater, you're this, you're that, you're this, you're that. And basically what he's saying, the story, the emperor has no clothes. He's just saying what the truth is. And for that, he's being branded. They don't want the truth. The truth is, about homosexuality and lesbian, it is unnatural. What do I mean by unnatural? What does God mean about unnatural? We don't mean morally sinful. It is. That's back in verse 24. Adultery and fornication is morally wrong. It's the natural man, but we're talking about his natural sinful nature, and that way. Here the word natural is physical. This is not the way God physically made man and women. It's not the way it's supposed to work. It's on natural. Jude 7, Jude says they're going after what? Strange flesh. And they themselves call themselves what? Queer. Because that's what it is. It's queer. It's vile, and it's an abomination, and it's unnatural. It's unnatural. They're sinning against nature. The way God created things to work physically in nature. Go back to Genesis chapter 1. I mean, this is grade school, but when God gives them up, your thinking goes right out. When I say by grade, I mean this is the kindergarten of how the world works. This is, if you leave the educated professors and philosophers and politicians out of it, almost any simpleton could figure this out, right? This is how we were made. Genesis chapter 2. I don't have my verse down. Okay, verse 23. And Adam said, "This is now a bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, because she is taken out of man. Therefore shall a man leave his father and his mother, shall cleave unto his wife, and they shall be what? One flesh." Not man and man, one flesh. Not woman and woman, but man and wife, one flesh. Not even just man and woman, man and wife. And they were both naked, the man and his wife, and were not. This is how God made it. God made it this way. And again, I'll say, as we've broken down God's order, this order, a man and a woman would enjoy intimate love, sexual enjoyment in marriage. Hebrews 12, verse 4. The marriage bed is undefiled and honorable. We have a way to procreate the human race, be fruitful and multiply, and we have a structure for society to raise our children and a godly home. And when this goes down the drain, society is finished. Oh, it may still be existing. And we've seen what happened to societies that God has given over. And what we are seeing today in our world is women are exploited more than ever. Sexual slavery. And if you saw some of those missionary videos, frontline missions, and what's going on with girls in the Far East, it's not just there, but some are enticed to come over here for work and made sex slaves, and some man put on a show here, and then they take the $1 million, fly over there, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. This is not for the good of society. God is a God of what? Order. A God of order. It's interesting, back in the book of Leviticus, they weren't even supposed to mix the seeds, right? You think we're to be done decently and in order. Order is how you, for instance, if we have no order, then how, think of raising children without order. So one day they get breakfast, the next day no breakfast. One day they're taken care of, the next, it's just hit or miss. And think of, the best way to take care of your life is to discipline it, is to have some order. That's why for many people, work is such a blessing. If they didn't have work, they would have no order in their life. I worked with a man like that. He cursed the work. He complained about it. but it's the only thing that kept his life from going completely down the drain into drugs and poor health and partying. He had to go to work. He had to get up in the morning. He had to do these things. And I had a tenant who was a good tenant, but when he quit his job, everything went down. And his friends came over and they took their welfare checks and did drugs. So he went from a life of order to a life of what? Disorder. Very quickly. I don't know where he's ended up. But God is a God of order. And to have this confusion, see, God wants life and more abundant life. That's what he told Adam and Eve. Multiply. That's what he told Noah. Multiply. And to have this confusion, and God hates it. He calls it unnatural. The second thing that we read here in this is the words, they burned in their lust one towards the other. Let's get this straight. Yeah, there may be some type of emotional love and stuff going on, but basically this is lust, not love, no matter what you're feeling on the inside. Just like a man cheating on his wife. It's not love, it's lust. Because it's not for the good for the one you're cheating with. It's not for love for your wife. Certainly not for love for God. And as Paul says, he that committeth fornication sinneth against his own body. They burned in their lust. The idea here is to be inflamed in their excitement. Like the men of Sodom would rape two strangers that come into the city. And when they were pulled inside and made blind, it says they came near to find the door. They wearied themselves all night. They're just inflamed with lust. And they want to call this good. Paul said, the Bible says, flee fleshly lust. Flee fleshly lust. Worldly lust. Escape the pollution which is in this world through lust. Now, how do you do that? Well, you don't fan the flames. But that's what they're doing today. It's being promoted. There was a day when these things, we wouldn't even talk about them in public. We have to talk about them from the pulpit because it's not only being talked about, but it's being promoted in magazine, books, TV, internet, music, taught in school, even grade school, promoted, encouraged, and even somewhat forced. That's where we're getting. If you haven't thought about it, we want you to think about it. We would even encourage you to try it. Where is this generation going to end up? They want this to be the new normal. In fact, they would promote it. I don't know. I never saw the movie. I don't plan to see the movie. But there was some Western that came out. I don't know if it was called Brokeback Mountain. About two homosexual cowboys. And it got all kinds of critical acclaim. Why? Because it was a great film with great cast? No, because it showed cowboys being homosexuals, and this was good. And what's next? That's their agenda. That's going to get praise. And that which speaks against it is going to be put down. In fact, with this social injustice and the racism, and it is real. I saw today they're tearing down statues of George Washington and of Christopher Columbus. See, anything that doesn't promote their agenda is going to be torn down. Why? Because they're burning in their lust towards one another. There's no end to what they want. Now these people are becoming what? We don't only talk about it, but they're now becoming our mayors, our teachers, our governors, our MPs, prime minister, president. And that's going to be a change for that's diversity. If it's diversity, it's got to be good. God is no respecter of persons. We're not talking race. We're not talking people because they're from a different nation. We're talking behavior, lifestyle, conduct. Now that which God calls evil, man is promoting. Proverbs 14:12, there is a way which seemeth right unto the man, but the end thereof are the ways of death. The wages of sin of death. And so Paul says here, not only did they burn their lust one to another, and I think I've skipped ahead here, bear with me. I did. Skip the whole. Working that which is unseemly. Working that which is unseemly. I'm having trouble reading my notes. That's okay. I'll get myself back. I get away from them and then I have to find myself. Yeah, that which is unseemly. Working. The word working means doing, practicing. And the idea of unseemly is that which is indecent, shameful, and not proper. These sins were always there, but now they're being promoted. So I just jumped ahead of that. These things were always there. They're doing that which should be unseemly. And now, as I just went through before I found where I should have been starting, is these things are now being promoted, publicized, triumphed. They can do in the pride parade what you cannot do if you weren't in a gay. And they are encouraging these things that are unseemly. Let's look at this last one here. Receiving in themselves the recompense of their error, which was meat. That brings me to Proverbs 14:12. There is a way which seemeth right unto a man, but the end thereof are the ways of death. I think it was Boyce. I have a quote ahead here, but they said, well, I want to escape God. I don't want God to have anything to do with me. And said, God lets them go their own way, and they end up where? In the ditch. And then they want to blame God for their own error. They want to blame God for their own error. Hebrews 2:2, if the word spoken by angels was steadfast, and every transgression and disobedience received a what? A just recompense of reward. And so Paul says they've received that recompense of their error. This is only fitting. This is only fitting that they would receive a reward for this. Paul says, as was meet or suitable. We are not told specifically here what this recompense of reward is. We don't know of being AIDS back then. And some say that sin, more sin, you're judged with more sin. That's not a blessing to them. That's a destruction for them to be allowed into more sin. That's one. We could think of venereal diseases. We could think of the breakdown of society and all the ills that brings upon them. That is all what? A recompense of their error, which was meat. That it is fitting. It's fitting that they would receive this. And I'll just... One commentator says an unnatural sin deserves an unnatural reward. How was Sodom and Gomorrah destroyed? Well, not naturally. Naturally, God would judge a city with what? Sword, pestilence, famine. I know of no other cities that God rained down fire and brimstone. In a sense, that was an unnatural judgment. God says, I've heard their cry, and here's what they deserve. That's pretty strong language. And so God gave them up, and that's what we see today. If we're not completely there, I don't know, we're 90% there in Canada.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know how much worse it can get. I guess we could start being put in jail. They start forcing it. I don't know. Maybe it's okay that, this age of consent or whatever, maybe that's going to be removed. I don't know. Who knows where they're going to end up in their folly if God gives them up. If God gives them up. I saw a couple of things, the only gay bar in Halifax or Dartmouth is closed, so they have no safe place to go to their bar. I said, that's great. The gay parade's canceled. That's great. Well, because I hate them? No, because maybe they'll start to think, maybe this is the mercy of God. And they'll start to think they no longer can trumpet it out in the streets and get the pats on the back. I pray for Canada in this. Let's look at verse 28, and again, I'm just getting my feet wet again here, but we look at their third step down, and I put it here, they did not like to retain God in their knowledge. When you do that which God calls as an abomination, when we sin, we just naturally do not want to have anything to do with God. First, we don't want to give God first place. Then we want to deny who He is, and then we don't even want to think about Him at all. They did not like to retain God in their knowledge. And that's what we see today. Let's do away with God. Do away with the idea of morality and accountability. Job 21:14, therefore they say unto God, what? Depart from us, for we desire not the knowledge of thy ways. Men don't believe in God, not because of reason, not because it's not rational, but because of sin. They hate God. That's just the truth. Turn to John chapter 3. I thought this would be fitting for this portion. He said they did not like to retain God in their knowledge. John chapter 3. I think when we think of the great verses in John chapter 3, we ignore this portion, but it's very important. Verses 19 and 20. Jesus said, this is the condemnation, that light is come into the world, and men love darkness rather than light. That's what we're seeing happening in Canada. Why? Because of the judgment of God. Because their deeds were evil. And everyone that doeth evil hateth the light. Neither cometh to the light, lest his deeds should be reproved. Now I know some of the homosexuals and stuff, they quote, well, God loves everybody, and this church is promoting us. But they're not interested in worshiping God or serving God. Certainly not the God of the Bible. And they don't want to hear anything about God's laws or God's rules. The only thing they might want to hear about a God is God loves everybody. He's tolerant of everything. So just keep doing what you're doing. And that's strong light. Jesus says He hateth the light. And they won't come to the light. They hate the light. It's not because the light's not there and it's not real. That life is the light of men, and so God's judgment to allow them to sin increases their hatred for God. Psalm 10:4, the wicked through the pride of his countenance will not seek after God. God is not in all his thoughts. And what do we see today in Canada and the United States? As sin increases, God and biblical truth are despised, under attack, seeking to restrict it, erase it, wipe it out. That's on the agenda of many in Canada and the United States. God's third judgment here, verse 28, God gave them over. There's the third one. God gave them over. Again, I thought of Pharaoh. Whom He will, He hardeneth. What did God give them over to? Here is to a reprobate mind. That is a mind that doesn't know right or wrong. A mind void of judgment without discernment. And that's certainly what we see all around us. They don't know the right hand from the left. They don't even believe there is a right or wrong. Or the only thing that could be wrong is for somebody to tell them they're wrong and not tolerant of them. But everything else, there's no such thing. I would say this is the final tipping point for society. Not only to allow sin, but not even able to know that it is sin. So these sins that are going to be listed here, we're not looking at them tonight, this list of sins. Yes, they were there 100 years ago, but they were hidden. They were suppressed by society. These things are now coming out in full. I think when you look ahead here, it says being filled with what? Being filled. Not just having. Now society is being filled with all these things. All unrighteousness, all fornication. That's what we see beginning to happen in our society here. How did we end up this way? I'll give you a quote from Boyce. At the end is a mind not merely foolish or in error, but totally depraved. It is a mind so depraved that it begins to think that which is bad is actually good, and that which is good is actually bad. It is the mind of Satan taking over man's thinking. And he says this is pure justice without mercy. God is under no obligation to stop man from going his own way. Isn't that what he did with Pharaoh? Pharaoh, you do not want to listen to me? Pharaoh hardened his heart. God says, I'll harden your heart. And Pharaoh said, well, yay, I can do what I want. I can pursue them into the Red Sea. The judgment is coming. It says here, they did not like to approve God in their knowledge. They did not like to retain God in their knowledge. That word, like to retain God, or like, means to approve. Otherwise, they disapproved of God, and God gave them over to a reprobate mind, a rejected mind, or a disapproved mind. Otherwise, they disapproved of God, God disapproves of them. We touched on this back in Proverbs chapter 2, I believe. And the language is, saying, well, God's loving, He's merciful, He's gracious, and all this. Actually, Proverbs chapter 1, He says, you said it not all my counsel, you would have none of my reproof. God has reproved them. Like society has said, let's forget about all that. And so God says, I'll laugh at your calamity. I will mock when your fear comes. When your fear cometh as desolation, and your destruction comes as a whirlwind, when distress and anguish cometh upon you, then they shall call upon me, but I will not answer. They shall seek me early, but they shall not find me. For they hated knowledge, and did not choose to fear the Lord. This is judgment. This is pure judgment. I'll give you again what Matthew Henry said. Spiritual judgment of all judgments are the sorest, and to be the most dread. Better God-sent pestilence, poverty, war to Canada, than to let it go the way it's going. That's pretty strong. And I think there's many that say, well, we just want to have all these sins and continue all the blessings. Well, it's just not going to happen. It's just not going to happen. Notice God gave them up to a reprobate mind. And what does that lead to here in verse 28? Because they have a mind devoid of judgment, they're going to do those things which are not convenient. Now, convenient here doesn't mean the word we usually use. It's not convenient. You get the word right now. The word convenient here means that which is proper, that which is becoming. Ecclesiastes 8:1, it says, because sentence against an evil work is not executed speedily, therefore the hearts of the Son of Man is fully set in them to what? To do evil. Because God is not restraining them, they have a reprobate mind, they can't restrain themselves, and they're going to do those things which are not convenient. That is the idea here. That which is proper. It's Strong says becoming. It's against reason, it's against logic, it's against common sense. I guess there was a bear out west, wasn't going to fly the pride flag. He says, why would I want to fly a flag? He says, if we, that we wouldn't, he just used natural words. He didn't use the word of God. That would, if we fully embrace that, it would wipe out the human race. Well, I don't know if he's still here or not, but anyways. Now, that was just recently. I thank God for that. That's a mirror. I talked about, if the pastor says, show my people their sin. For the prime minister to stand up and denounce homosexuality. He's not the king, sovereign king of Canada. So I don't know what Trudeau really thinks. I don't think he cares, as long as Trudeau is in. And I'm not trying to bash the prime minister here. He's not going to do anything to rock the boat. And that's the way most of the politicians operate today. Even if they disapprove, they're going to, it says, doing those things which are not convenient. That's what we see happening. When society has a reprobate mind, it starts doing those things which are not proper, you're going to see where we end up in verses 29 to 32. That's quite a list that Paul gives here. And I want you to impress yourself with that word all. Apply it to every one of those. All unrighteousness, all fornication, all wickedness, all covetousness. Not that those things are there, but they're kept hidden, they're suppressed. But no, they're given up. They're given over wholly to it, and we see that attitude in verse 32. Pray for the country. I don't want to pray for war or anything. Unless this country is shaken up. Unless the United States is shaken up. Unless God restrains. Better to hear the gospel. Better for revival in the churches and awakening in the community. I pray for Cornwall. I think, I can find a lot of fault with the churches in Cornwall. But there's 3 or 4 that are out on the streets preaching. There's 3 or 4 that are praying and seeking revival. Well, they haven't joined us, I know that. But they're thinking about it, they're making moves. Keep praying. Ourselves, we haven't been broken yet, but by God's grace we want to be faithful. By God's grace He will bring us revival. Why not Cornwall? Why not Cornwall? I pray for the pastors in Cornwall to not lose their focus. Like Pastor Taylor said to me, here's how I look on Cornwall. It's been the devil's playground, he says. There are issues, yeah, I have issues with things they do there. Concerns, but I have the same issues. I have concerns for us, including myself. We need to seek the Lord. We need to seek the Lord. This is not a pretty picture. And this is, this is unnatural. This is vile affections. This is God's judgment. It's very serious. Very serious. And we need to be, we can't be asleep or complacent. And I say it would start with intercession for the nation. We need to intercede for the city, we need to intercede for the nation. And we need revival in the church. Let's close with a hymn.